The morning James Trask saddled his roan gelding and rode toward the Caldwell livestock auction. He had exactly one thing on his mind: a good working horse to replace the mare he had lost to colic 3 weeks prior. And he had absolutely no idea that by sundown, his entire understanding of what it meant to come home would be turned on its head. Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, was not a town for the faint of heart. It sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a brash challenge thrown up against the open prairie, a place where cattle drovers pushed enormous herds north, and where every manner of man with every manner of intention passed through. The stockyards ran thick with the smells of livestock and leather, and too many men who had not bathed since crossing the Red River. The saloons kept their doors swinging day and night. The sheriff walked with his hand always close to his holster, not out of vanity, but out of plain necessity. It was a wild, loud, unapologetic town, and James Trask had called the land surrounding it home for going on 6 years. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way that came not from vanity, but from working 160 acres largely by himself. His hair was dark and straight, pushed flat by the hat he wore from sunup to sundown, and his jaw carried the kind of stubble a man accumulates when there is nobody around to remind him to shave. He had a spread of decent farmland and cattle pasture about 7 miles west of Caldwell, a small but solid house he had built with his own hands and the help of his neighbor Abe Collier, a smokehouse, a good well, and a working barn. What he did not have was a second horse, which was why he rose before dawn, cooked himself a quick pan of cornmeal mush, and set out on the roan, a dependable but aging animal by the name of Copper, toward the auction yards. The auction was held on the second Saturday of every month in a wide yard behind the livery on Kishom Street. By the time James arrived, the place was already a living, shifting mass of humanity. Cowboys off the trail leaned against fence posts with their thumbs hooked in their belts, assessing the animals with the careful eyes of men who knew what good horseflesh meant to their lives. Local farmers clustered together, comparing what they saw. A handful of Comanche traders moved at the outer edge, watching everything, engaging in nothing they had not first decided. Children darted between adult legs, and somewhere off toward the far end of the yards, a man with a fiddle was playing something lively and completely at odds with the general mood of transaction and commerce. James tied Copper to the rail, pulled his hat brim down against the already climbing sun, and walked the line of horses in the holding pen, looking each one over with a practiced eye. There was a big bay draft mix that was far too much horse for what he needed. A piebald with a front leg that looked like it had been badly set after a break. A line of 3 decent-looking quarter horses, younger animals that still had some green about them, and a gray mare that had good haunches but whose eyes showed too much white when the crowd pressed close. He was leaning on the fence, studying the gray mare, trying to decide if her nervousness was a matter of the day's commotion or her permanent temperament, when the sound reached him. It was not loud, exactly. It did not rise above the general noise of the auction yard. But there was something in the quality of it, a woman's voice, strained with the effort of keeping itself level when everything underneath it was clearly near to breaking, that made James straighten up and turn without quite deciding to. 20 feet down the fence line, a woman was standing very still at the edge of the crowd near the auction platform. She was perhaps 26 or 27, though her expression carried something older than her years. She wore a dark blue dress that had been good once and was still clean, but showed the careful mending at the cuffs that spoke of hard times managed with pride. Her hair was the color of deep amber, pinned up under a modest bonnet that had been recently blocked, and her hands, which she was gripping together in front of her, were the hands of someone who worked for a living. Standing directly across from her, using his body and the bulk of 2 companions to crowd her against the fence in a way that was designed to look casual and was anything but, was a man James recognized without pleasure. Clay Harmon was a cattle buyer out of Texas who passed through Caldwell several times a year. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, florid-faced, thick-chested, and possessed of the easy arrogance of a man who had money, and was not troubled by the thought of how he used it. He was holding a folded piece of paper, and he was holding it up in front of the woman's face in a way that was more threat than conversation. "You understand what this document represents," Harmon was saying, his voice carrying the false patience of a man who found the whole exchange amusing. "It's a legal note. Your father signed it. $230 owed against that property, and the grace period ran out on the 1st of April. I've got every legal right in the state of Kansas to put those animals up today." The woman, who James would learn was named Ruth Chandler, did not flinch, though the effort of not flinching was visible in the set of her jaw. "My father signed that note under the understanding that it was a lending arrangement between neighbors," she said. "He was dying. He was not in a full state of mind, and he did not understand what he was signing." "Now that's a real sad story," Harmon said, folding the note back into his breast pocket with a satisfied little tuck. "But it's not my problem, it's your problem. And what you've got up on that platform in about 20 minutes is 12 head of good cattle and the best working horse in Sumner County, and once that gavel comes down, all of it belongs to whoever bids highest, and you walk away with whatever's left after my debt is settled, which, from what I've seen of these numbers, may not be very much at all." One of Harmon's companions laughed, a low, unpleasant sound. Ruth Chandler looked at him with eyes that held something that was not quite hatred and not quite grief, but was some devastating mixture of both. "You are taking everything that man spent his life building," she said quietly. "He is barely 2 months in the ground." "Business does not observe mourning periods, sweetheart," Harmon said and turned away. James Trask had not moved from his spot on the fence. He had heard every word. He stood there for a moment, very still, with the practical part of his mind running a quick, cold accounting. His savings, what a horse was going to cost him, what $230 represented against the buffer he kept in the bank in Caldwell for emergencies. And then he pushed off the fence rail and walked after Clay Harmon. "Harmon," he said, and the man turned with the irritated look of someone who expects either a transaction or an argument, and is prepared for neither to be particularly interesting. "Trask," Harmon said, recognizing him after a beat, "here to buy something." "I want to see that note," James said. Harmon raised an eyebrow. "I don't believe that's any of your business." "I'm making it my business," James said. He kept his voice easy, the way you speak when you want a man to understand you are serious without giving him the excuse to make it into something that requires a gun. "I want to see it." There was a pause while Harmon decided how to read this, and then, with the expression of a man who sees no threat in some entertainment, he pulled out the paper and unfolded it. James took it from him, turned slightly to use the better morning light and read it. It was a promissory note, signed with a shaking hand that suggested either illness or age, and the terms were exactly as Harmon had described. $230 dated November of 1878 with an April 1st, 1879 settlement date. The signature at the bottom read Elias Chandler. He handed it back. "What do you want for it?" he asked. Harmon blinked. "What?" "The note. What do you want to sell it to me for?" There was a silence, and then Harmon laughed, and the laugh was genuine. "Now why in the Lord's name would I sell you a note that's about to net me 12 head of cattle and a prize horse at auction prices, when I paid barely $40 to a desperate man in November? Because if you sell it to me now, you get your money today without the trouble of standing through an auction, and you leave this town without anyone watching too closely at the circumstances under which you managed to get a dying man to sign over his daughter's inheritance," James said. He said it pleasantly, the way you might say something about the weather. The amusement in Harmon's face went flat. He looked at James for a long moment, doing his own accounting. There was something in James's manner that communicated, without threat or drama, that he was a man who meant exactly what he said, and who had already decided what he was going to do. That kind of quiet certainty was harder to ignore than a raised voice. "I want $275, Harmon said. "You're paying for my trouble." "I'll give you 240, James said. 260. 245, James said. "That is my final offer, and I will pay it in cash at the bank window on Main Street inside the hour. Take it or leave it." Harmon studied him for another moment, and then he said, "Fine," with the tone of a man who has decided that this particular transaction is not worth further negotiation, but who wants it understood that the concession is his to give. They shook hands, and James walked back to where Ruth Chandler was still standing at the fence. She had not moved. She had watched the entire exchange, and now she looked at him with an expression that was not quite hope, because hope was something she appeared to have learned not to lean on too heavily, but was something adjacent to it, a careful, cautious, wondering thing. "Miss Chandler," he said, because he had heard Harmon address her by name. "I don't know you," she said. It was not unfriendly. It was simply a statement of fact from a woman who understood that in 1879, on the Kansas plains, a stranger doing something kind was something that required understanding before it could be accepted. "My name is James Trask. I have a farm about 7 miles west. I'm going to buy your father's note from Clay Harmon." He paused. "I don't want anything in return. You can pay me back whatever you can, whenever you can, or not at all. That's your business. But those cattle and that horse are going to stay on your land." Ruth stared at him. The bonnet framed her face, and the morning sun was full on her now, and he could see that her eyes were a shade between green and gray, the color of the prairie after a spring rain, and that they were bright with something she was fighting very hard to keep inside. "You don't know me," she said, echoing her own words with a slight difference of emphasis this time. "No," he agreed. "But I know what a man like Harmon looks like when he's done something crooked, and I know what a woman looks like when she's trying to hold together everything her family built." He paused. "I had better go catch him before he changes his mind. You'll hear from me about the arrangements." He touched the brim of his hat, and he walked away, and behind him Ruth Chandler stood very still for a long time, pressing her lips together, steadying herself, because she was absolutely not going to cry in the middle of the Caldwell livestock auction. The business with Harmon was concluded at the Caldwell Farmers Bank before 10 in the morning, witnessed by the bank manager, a meticulous man named Horace Prewitt, who drew up a simple transfer of lien with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen stranger things. James walked out of the bank $245 lighter, holding a piece of paper that represented the entirety of Ruth Chandler's trouble, and he stood for a moment on the boardwalk of Main Street in the warming Kansas morning, and reflected that he had come to town to buy a horse and was going home without one. He also reflected, with some degree of surprise at himself, that he did not particularly mind. He rode out to her farm that afternoon. He had asked Prewitt if he knew the Chandler property, and the banker, too professional to comment on the transaction he had just witnessed, had nonetheless given him simple directions. 3 miles south of the main road off the Sumner County marker, look for the red windmill. James found it without trouble. The windmill was old but functional, its red paint faded to a burnt rose by years of sun, and it sat at the edge of a property that was modest but clearly cared for. The fence lines were straight. The barn, though it needed paint, had a solid roof. The kitchen garden behind the house showed the neat rows of early planting, the first green tips of something, onions, maybe, or early greens, just beginning to push through the turned soil. The house itself was a clapboard structure, one story with a narrow porch running across the front, and it had the particular quality of a house that has been lived in and loved for a long time without a great deal of money, but with a great deal of effort. There were curtains in the windows, clean and white. There was a butter churn beside the door, and a pair of work boots standing next to it. Ruth Chandler came out onto the porch before he had finished tying copper to the post, which told him she had heard him coming from some distance, and had been watching from inside. She had changed out of the blue dress, and was wearing a work dress of faded brown muslin, her hair still pinned up but without the bonnet now, and she was wiping her hands on a cloth apron with the automatic gesture of someone interrupted in the middle of cooking. She looked at him for a moment and then she said, "I was not sure you were real." "I'm real enough," he said. He pulled the bank document from his vest pocket and came up the 2 porch steps and held it out to her. "This is the transfer record. The note is cleared. The cattle and the horse are yours free and clear of any lien." She took the paper with both hands, the way you take something precious, and looked at it for a long moment. Her face was very still. "Come inside," she said finally. "I have coffee on." The interior of the house was exactly what the exterior had suggested: orderly, clean, spare, and carrying the particular dignity of people who do not have much but take care of what they have. A wooden table with 4 chairs stood in the center of the kitchen. A cast iron stove along the far wall held a coffee pot, and the makings of what appeared to be a pot of beans already slow cooking for the evening. On the shelf above the stove were a few books, a painted tin with dried herbs, and a small framed photograph of a man who had to be her father, serious-faced, white-haired, looking at the camera with the direct gaze of someone who had worked hard his whole life and was not ashamed of it. Ruth poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat down, and James sat across from her, and for a moment the room was quiet except for the soft creak of the windmill outside and the low sound of the beans simmering. "How old was he?" James asked, nodding at the photograph. 64, she said. "Pneumonia. He was sick from November and gone by February." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He did not know what he was signing. I want you to understand that. He thought Harmon was offering to help us get through the winter. He was feverish half the time. I did not find out about the note until Harmon came to the door 2 weeks after the funeral." "I believe you," James said simply. She looked at him. "Why?" He considered the question honestly. "Because the man I watched on that auction floor today was the kind of man who finds opportunity in other people's grief," he said. "And the note was dated November, when by everyone's account your father was already sick. That timing is not an accident." She nodded slowly, looking back at her coffee cup. $245, she said. "I heard you tell Mr. Pruitt. I don't have that kind of money, Mr. Trask. I'm going to be honest with you about that. I have a good herd and I have the horse, and I will sell cattle when I can and I will put money by, but it will take time." "I am not in any rush," he said. "I also," she continued, with the careful tone of a woman who has thought this through and is going to say what needs to be said regardless, "need to understand what you expect. You are a man I have never met before today, and you spent a considerable amount of money on my behalf, and in my experience, people do not do that without wanting something." It was plainly and directly said, and James respected it. He took a sip of his coffee, which was very good, strong and clean, and set the cup down. "I expect nothing," he said. "I told you that this morning and I meant it. If you want to call it a neighborly loan, you can pay me back when you're able and not a day before. If you want to call it a gift, I am in a position to afford it and you are welcome to it. What I do not want, and I will be equally plain with you, is for you to feel that you owe me anything beyond what you decide you want to give." Ruth studied him with those rain-colored eyes, doing her own kind of accounting, and then she said something he had not expected. "Why did you do it?" He thought about lying, thought about giving some practical answer, something about the impropriety of what Harmon was doing, something civic and uninvolved, but there was something about the directness of the question and the directness of the woman asking it that made him tell the truth instead. "I don't entirely know," he said. "I saw what was happening and I thought about riding on and I couldn't." He paused. "I have 7 miles of fence I ride every week to keep in order. I have a barn and a house and a well, and I have nobody to share any of it with. I think maybe I have been living very practically for a long time, and something about this morning didn't feel like a morning for practicality." The words surprised him as much as they apparently surprised her. Ruth looked at him for a long, measured moment, and then something in her face changed, not softened exactly, but opened, the way a window opens to let in the air. She picked up her coffee cup again, and there might have been the smallest beginning of a smile at the corner of her mouth, though she contained it efficiently. "You will need a horse," she said. "You came to the auction for one and you went home without one." He laughed then, a genuine laugh, and it felt easy in the kitchen of this house he had never been in before. "I did notice that. Elia's my father. He had a buckskin gelding named Solomon. He is a fine horse, 7 years old, well trained. I cannot pay you $245 in cash, but I can give you the use of Solomon for as long as you need him, and I can contribute a share of this year's calf crop toward the debt. It is not nothing." "It is absolutely not nothing," he said. He looked at her steadily. "I'll accept that arrangement, Miss Chandler." "Ruth," she said. And then, as if surprised by her own quickness to offer it, she added, "If you are going to be my creditor and my neighbor, you might as well use my given name." "James," he said, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table in the quiet of the afternoon, and something entirely new and entirely uncalculated passed between them like a current through still water. He stayed for another hour, and they talked about the farm, what she needed, what her plans were for the herd, whether the fence on the north pasture was going to hold through the summer. It was practical conversation, the kind people have when they are getting their footing with each other. And it was also something more than practical, because underneath the discussion of pasture fence and cattle prices, there was the sensation of two people discovering that talking to each other was surprisingly easy, and that easy was not what either of them had expected. When he finally rose to go, she walked him out to the porch, and he untied Copper from the post, and she leaned against the porch rail and said, "James." He turned, his hand on the saddle. "Thank you," she said. It was quiet and complete, with everything in it that she had been carrying all day, and he understood that she was not a woman who said it lightly. "You're welcome, Ruth," he said, and meant every syllable. He rode home through the long Kansas evening, the sun going flat and orange behind him, and the prairie grass moving in the warm spring wind, and he thought about her face in the kitchen and the particular quality of her voice when she had said his name for the first time, and he thought that he had come to the auction for a horse, and had come home with something that he did not yet have a name for but that already felt more important than any horse he had ever owned. He came back 3 days later, riding Solomon, the buckskin gelding who turned out to be everything Ruth had said, smooth-gaited, responsive, smart in the way that some horses are smart, following the fence line without being asked when James took him out for the first time along the edge of the home pasture. He came on the pretext of returning a harness buckle Ruth had mentioned was the wrong size for the traces she was using, which was a real thing, but also, if James was being honest with himself, an opportunity that he might not have pursued with quite such promptness, were the whole situation purely practical. Ruth was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, on her knees between the rows with a hand trowel, doing the early season work of cutting weeds before they established themselves. She had on a battered sunbonnet and work gloves, and she was entirely unself-conscious about the dirt on the gloves and the smear of it on her cheek, and James found this unreasonably appealing. She looked up when she heard him, and the thing that happened on her face when she recognized him was brief, a quick brightness, that she did not entirely manage to contain before it settled into her more characteristic expression of composed, observant attention. He noticed it and said nothing about it, because he understood that whatever was happening between them was fragile in the way that new things are fragile, and that the right approach was patience and plain dealing rather than anything that might put her on guard. He gave her the buckle, and she looked at it and confirmed that yes, this was the right size, and she thanked him, and he said he was glad to help, and they stood there for a moment in the kitchen garden with the warm morning sun on the turned earth and neither of them in a particular hurry to conclude the conversation. "How are the cattle settling?" he asked. "Well," she said. "I moved them to the south pasture where the grass is coming in thicker. There is a calf that I think will sell well in the fall, good size, good build." She pulled off one glove and pointed with her bare hand toward the pasture beyond the fence. "See the white-faced one near the water trough? That is the one." He looked, and the calf was exactly what she described, well conformed, with the depth of body that promised good weight at market time. "You have a good eye," he said. "My father taught me," she said simply. "He taught me everything about this place. He did not have a son, and he decided that was not a good enough reason for me not to know how to run the farm." She paused. Not everyone agreed with him on that point. "I do," James said. She looked at him with that careful, weighing quality, and then she said, "Would you like to stay for the noon meal? I have bread and cold ham, and I was going to put together a pot of vegetable soup. It is nothing special." "It sounds very special to me," he said, and the honesty in it made her look away for a moment with something that was not quite embarrassment but was in that direction, a warmth she was not sure what to do with. She fed him well. The bread was made from a sourdough culture that she said had been in her family since her mother's time, and the soup was better than simple, thick with vegetables from last year's cellar stores and seasoned with the dried herbs from the shelf above the stove. They ate at the kitchen table and they talked, and it was the kind of talking that builds something, the kind where you learn a person not just through facts but through the way they say things, the pauses they keep, what they choose to share and what they leave aside. He learned that she had grown up on this land, had been born in the room that was now the storage room because her father had later expanded the house. He learned that her mother had died when Ruth was 14, and that she had run the household from that point onward while also finishing what schooling she could, and that she had eventually been well enough taught to spend 2 years boarding in Wichita as a teacher's assistant before her father's health began to decline, and she had come home. He learned that she had a sharp, dry sense of humor that appeared infrequently and was all the funnier for its rarity. She learned that he was from Missouri originally, that he had come to Kansas in 1873 after a run of bad luck with drought, and a family decision to scatter that he had taken hard at the time and had since made his peace with. She learned that he had built his house largely himself and that he was prouder of the kitchen chimney, which drew perfectly in all weather, than anything else about the structure. She learned that he read when he could find books and that he had strong opinions about what made a good horse that he was willing to defend at length. By the time the meal was cleared, the afternoon was well advanced and neither of them had noticed. "I should go," he said, though he said it without any particular conviction. "You should probably come back next week," she said, and said it with such matter-of-fact calm that it took him a moment to understand that she was not proposing a practical arrangement, but was, in her direct way, saying something that meant considerably more. "I will," he said, and he did. He came back the following week and the week after that and then twice the week after that. By the time May had worn into June, and the Kansas summer was pressing down on the plains with its full weight, James Trask was spending 3 or 4 days of every week at the Chandler farm, nominally helping with the fence work and the cattle management that Ruth, operating the property alone, genuinely needed assistance with, and factually also because the farm had become the place he most wanted to be, and Ruth had become the person he most wanted to be near. She did not make it easy, which he respected. She was not cold, she was, in fact, warmly generous in her conversation and her interest, and in the way she consistently set a second place at the table without making it a point of discussion. But she was careful. She had been handling everything alone for a long time, and the habit of self-sufficiency had the quality of a fence she was used to working inside. She did not lean on him, even when he was there to lean on. She asked for help when she needed it, and accepted it with clear and specific thanks. But she made it understood without words that this farm was hers, her management and her responsibility, and that any help was welcome but not required. He found this entirely admirable and also somewhat maddening, because what he wanted, increasingly and with a clarity that surprised him with its intensity, was to stop being her neighbor and creditor, and to be something else entirely. Something that did not yet have a formal name between them, but that was present every time she laughed at one of his observations, or turned to show him something about one of the cattle and put her hand briefly on his arm, or stood beside him at the fence in the evenings, watching the sunset turn the prairie into a sea of copper and rose, and simply stayed there, close enough that he could smell the lavender she dried for her linens. The question was how to say it in a way that was honest without frightening her, that made clear what he felt without making her feel that the kindness he had shown her 3 months ago was conditional on her receiving it in a particular way. He was thinking about this on a Friday afternoon in late June, when the afternoon heat drove them both under the shade of the big cottonwood at the edge of her north pasture, where they often ended up when the day's work was done. She had brought cold water in a tin canteen, and they were sitting in the grass with their backs against the trunk, and she was telling him about a letter she had received from a school friend who had moved to Colorado, and halfway through the telling she stopped and said, with no warning at all, "James, what are we doing?" He looked at her. She was looking at the pasture, not at him, with the expression of someone who has been composing a question for a while and has decided to stop composing it and simply ask it. "What do you mean?" he said, though he knew. "I mean," she said carefully, "that you come here several days of every week and you work alongside me and you eat at my table, and I look forward to it every time, which is something I have not said out loud and am apparently saying now." She paused. "I want to know what it is, because I think I know what it is for me, but I do not know how to proceed without knowing what it is for you, and I would rather ask the plain question than let it turn into something unspoken and complicated." He turned to look at her fully then, and she turned to look at him, and they were very close in the dappled shade of the cottonwood. "It is the same thing for me," he said. "Has been since the morning I watched you stand your ground against Harmon in that auction yard and refuse to let your face show what it was costing you." Something in her face shifted, and her eyes went bright in the way he had seen once before in her kitchen on the first afternoon. "James," she said quietly. "I don't want to rush you," he said. "You've had a hard year and you're still finding your footing, and I know that. But I would like, if you are willing, for us to begin to be honest about it. About what this is." She looked at him for a long moment with all the care and deliberateness that characterized everything she did, and then she said, "I am willing." He took her hand, and she let him, and they sat under the cottonwood in the long summer afternoon, with the cattle grazing in the pasture beyond them and the prairie wind moving through the tall grass, and neither of them said anything more for a while, because nothing more needed to be said. Summer came on in earnest after that, and with it a change in the quality of their time together that was not dramatic but was profound. The ease of two people who have decided to stop pretending they are something less than they are and can now simply be what they are, which was a man and a woman falling steadily and thoroughly in love. He brought her books from the lending shelf at the Caldwell General Store, a battered copy of Great Expectations that he had read twice and wanted her to read, and a new almanac, and a small volume of Longfellow poetry that the storekeeper's wife had recommended when he was less than specific about who it was for. She read them all and argued cheerfully with him about the ending of the Dickens, and said 3 of the Longfellow poems were very fine and the rest were not. He agreed about all 3. She came out to his farm once in July, riding Solomon, unannounced, and with the air of a woman who has decided that if this is what they are to each other, then she ought to know where he lives. He was in the barn fixing a trace when she rode in, and his face when he looked up and found her there told her, very clearly and without any words at all, precisely how much he had wanted to see her that day. He showed her everything. The kitchen with its well-drawing chimney that he was in fact extremely proud of. The vegetable garden that was larger than he needed and better planned than his bachelor life required, a fact she noted with amusement. The cattle pasture with the summer herd, leaner than hers but well managed. The house, which was 4 rooms, spare and clean, with a good floor and a fireplace and walls he had whitewashed himself, and which had the quality of a place waiting to be more than it currently was. She stood in the middle of his kitchen and looked around slowly, and he stood in the doorway and watched her, and then she said, "You built this place thinking about more than yourself, didn't you?" It was not quite a question. "I suppose I did," he said. She looked at him, and she smiled a full, open, unhesitating smile that was different in quality from the careful near smiles he had been accumulating since March, and it did something to his chest that he was glad the doorframe was there to steady him against. By August, the whole county seemed to have noticed what was happening, in the way that small communities notice everything eventually. When James and Ruth rode together into Caldwell on a Saturday morning to collect supplies, the looks they got ranged from the warmly approving to the frankly curious, and old Mary Settle, who ran the dry goods counter at Prewitt's General Store, took Ruth's hand with the expression of someone conferring a blessing when they came in to collect flour and salt. There was also, inevitably, a less pleasant reaction. Harmon had left Caldwell in April without incident, but he had apparently spoken to people, and there was a story circulating at the saloon end of town, the part of town that minded everyone's business most enthusiastically, about how James Trask had been taken advantage of by a clever woman with a hard-luck story. James heard this on a Thursday afternoon from his neighbor Abe Collier, who delivered the information with the nervous energy of a man who is not sure how his interlocutor is going to receive it. James leaned on the corral fence and listened, and then he said, "Abe, if every man who spent his savings on a woman he admired was being taken advantage of, there would be very few marriages in this country." Abe blinked. Is that what this is? Marriage?" James considered. "I haven't asked her yet," he said, with the slight smile of a man who is planning something he has not yet done. He asked her on a Thursday evening in September. The harvest was coming in by then, and the air had that golden, heavy quality that Kansas had in the early fall, the light going amber and thick in the afternoons, and the evenings carrying the first edge of the cool that would eventually become winter. They were sitting on her porch after supper, which had become their pattern when he stayed late, watching the sky go purple and deep blue in the east while the west still held its long pink glow. He had the ring in his pocket. It had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band with a small garnet setting, and he had written to his sister in Missouri in July asking her to send it, and she had, with a letter full of exclamation points and the information that she had told their mother and their mother had cried, which he found touching. He took it out of his pocket and held it in his hand, and Ruth, who was in the rocking chair beside him with a cup of evening tea, looked at it and then looked at him, and her hand went still on the cup. "Ruth Chandler," he said, "I came to the Caldwell auction in March to buy a horse, and I went home without one, and I have not stopped thinking for a single day since then that it was the best day I ever spent in this county." He paused. "I would like very much to marry you if you will have me. Not because of any arrangement or any debt or any practical consideration, but because you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my time on this earth with you on it." Ruth set down her teacup with a very careful hand, and then she turned in the rocking chair to face him fully, and her eyes were bright with that quality he had first seen in her kitchen in March, the thing she always fought not to show, and this time she did not fight it. "James Trask," she said, and her voice was entirely steady, which he suspected cost her something. "I have been in love with you since the afternoon you sat at my kitchen table and told me you did not know why you had done what you did, but that you had done it because it was not a morning for practicality." She stopped. "Yes, my answer is yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him, and then he leaned forward in his chair and kissed her for the first time, there on the porch of her father's house in the first breath of autumn, with the prairie spread out before them in the evening light, and it was the kind of kiss that settles things, quiet and certain and entirely complete. They were married on a Saturday in October at the small Methodist church on the west side of Caldwell, which was a plain white building that let in too much wind through its north-facing windows and smelled of candle wax and old hymnals, and which was, on that particular Saturday morning, filled with more people than James had anticipated, and more flowers than the season had any right to provide. because it turned out that every woman in the county who had heard about what James had done at the auction in March had been waiting for this day with considerable enthusiasm and had raided their dwindling fall gardens accordingly. Abe Collier stood up with James and looked entirely emotional about it, which was characteristic of Abe. Ruth had no family living nearby, but Mary Settle from the dry goods store had appointed herself in the role of honorary older relation and was sitting in the front pew with the satisfied expression of someone whose fundamental faith in the world had been vindicated. Ruth came down the brief aisle of the church in a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs that she had been collecting for years against an occasion she had not been sure would come. And she looked so precisely right, so entirely herself and entirely beautiful in the same moment, that James stood at the altar and forgot briefly about everything except her face. The minister, a young man named Aldrich who was newer to Caldwell than most of his congregation, and was trying very hard to be worthy of the trust they placed in him, performed a service that managed to be brief and genuinely felt at the same time, which was harder than it appeared. When James put the ring on her finger the second time, and when she put the plain gold band she had quietly purchased in Wichita on his, and when Aldrich said the words that made them what they were from that moment forward, Ruth looked at her husband with her clear rain-colored eyes and held his hand steady, and he held her steady back. After the reception, at which Mary Settle contributed 3 pies of varying sizes and Abe Collier made a toast that started earnestly and became increasingly rhapsodic, and at which it became clear that the county at large was delighted by the whole thing in the uncomplicated way that people are delighted when something good happens to people who deserve it, James and Ruth Trask rode home together in the evening. They had decided on his farm as the foundation of their combined operation. It was larger, and the house, with some additions, was more expandable, while still maintaining Ruth's property as a working cattle pasture, which they would manage together. The house that James had built with more rooms than his bachelor life required turned out to need them. Ruth came to it with her father's photograph and her mother's sourdough culture, and the books from the shelf above the stove, and a particular set of opinions about where things ought to go that James found himself in full agreement with on about 2/3 of the points, and willing to negotiate on the rest, which seemed like a reasonable basis for a shared life. She replanted her kitchen garden alongside his, and they were larger together than either had been separately, which also seemed like something. Winter came to the Kansas plains in November with its full, unreasonable weight, the way it always did, sudden and serious, turning the world white and still and requiring the particular frontier competence of people who knew how to prepare for it and had. James and Ruth were prepared. The root cellar was full. The woodpile was cut high. The cattle were brought into the lower pasture with its windbreak. Solomon and Copper and the new buckskin mare James had finally bought at the December auction in Caldwell were stalled in the good warm barn, and the house was sealed against the wind and smelled in the evenings of wood smoke, and the sourdough bread Ruth baked twice a week, and the dried lavender she had hung from the kitchen ceiling. They spent the winter evenings at the kitchen table, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes playing the card game that Ruth had learned from her father and that James found humbling, because she won with a consistency that he suspected was not entirely luck. He read to her sometimes from the books, and she argued with the texts with the engaged irreverence of a woman who had always wanted more books than circumstance had provided and was making up for lost time. On the evenings when the wind was truly savage and the temperature dropped below what the thermometer he had mounted on the porch would reliably measure, they sat by the fire instead, and he would listen to her talk about the farm, about what she hoped for in the spring, about the memories of her father that were still fresh enough to surface unexpectedly. And he would think, with a quiet wonder that did not diminish as the weeks passed, that this was the life he had been building toward without knowing it. There were hard things, as there always were. In February, one of the cattle died in a cold snap despite their best efforts, and Ruth took the loss hard, not dramatically, but in the quiet way she took everything hard, which was with a kind of compressed grief that needed time to work through. He let her work through it without trying to fix it, because he had learned that what she needed in those moments was not solutions but presence, and he was good at being present. She had, in those months, also revealed to him the full depth of what she had been carrying alone since her father got sick, the financial anxiety that had underwritten every decision she had made in the past year, the exhaustion of fighting for everything without anyone to fight alongside her, the loneliness that had been so constant she had stopped being able to see it clearly. She told him these things not in one grand confession, but in small pieces over the course of the winter evenings, the way you tell someone things when you have stopped being afraid that they will use the telling against you. He listened to all of it, and he held her hands across the kitchen table when the telling was hard, and he was careful never to look as dismayed as he sometimes felt on her behalf, because what she needed was not his dismay but his steadiness, and steadiness was something he could reliably provide. By the time March came back around, bringing with it the first tentative green on the south-facing slopes and the sound of birds returning to the cottonwoods along the creek, Ruth Trask had settled into the house and the life, and the partnership of it with a thoroughness that made James think sometimes that the house itself had been waiting for her, the way the ring had fit when he put it on her finger in September, as though the dimensions had been calculated in advance by something more deliberate than coincidence. It was on a warm March morning, almost exactly 1 year to the day from the Caldwell auction, that Ruth stood in the kitchen with a particular expression on her face, composed, as always, but underneath the composure something luminous and slightly stunned, and told him that she was expecting. He stood very still for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen floor and put his arms around her, and she pressed her forehead against his chest and let out a long, slow breath, like something she had been holding for a while. "Are you pleased?" she asked into his shirt. "I am so pleased," he said, and meant it with every fiber of himself. She pulled back and looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and she was doing what she always did, which was fighting it, and he put his thumb against her cheek and said, "You do not have to hold it in. There is nobody here but me." And she laughed instead, which was perhaps even better. The spring of 1880 was the best spring either of them could remember, though it was also a working spring. The cattle needed management, the planting needed doing, the fence on the north side needed the repair that winter had made inevitable, and the east side of the house, where James had always planned to add a room, now needed to be added with some actual urgency. Abe Collier came over 2 Saturdays running with his eldest son Thomas, who was 15 and extremely capable with a hammer, and together the 4 of them, because Ruth, advanced pregnancy notwithstanding, was not a woman who stood aside when there was work to be done, that she could participate in framed and roofed and floored, and walled a room that would be a bedroom for the child, with a window facing east so it would get the morning light. Ruth put her hand on the new window frame when it was done and looked out at the east field and the cottonwoods along the creek turning gold in the May afternoon, and James stood beside her and looked at the same view, and the room smelled of new lumber and fresh plaster and the possibility of things that had not yet happened. Their son was born in July. He was a large, loud, thoroughly healthy boy who arrived in the world on a Tuesday afternoon with Caldwell's midwife, Mrs. Petra Hanks, in attendance, and whose first act was to make absolutely clear that he had opinions about the world he had entered and intended to express them vigorously. Ruth labored with the same focused, inward determination she brought to everything difficult, and James was there through all of it because she had asked him to be, and because he could not have been anywhere else. When Mrs. Hanks placed the baby in his arms, James looked at the small, enormous face of his son, and something happened to him that he had no adequate words for, a tectonic shift in the foundations of what he cared about. The world rearranging itself around a new center of gravity in a way that was total and instantaneous and left no room for qualification. "Look at him," Ruth said from the bed, her voice worn and warm and full of a wonder she was not, for once, keeping to herself. He looked at her then, his wife in the afternoon light, and he thought about everything that had led to this room, to this moment: a morning at a livestock auction, a piece of paper, a cup of coffee at a kitchen table, and it struck him with the full force of the obvious thing that has been true for a long time before you find the words for it, that a man's life is built in the places where he chooses not to ride on. They named the boy Elias James Trask, after her father, and he was called Eli from his first day, and he grew the way all children do, fast and continuously, and with an appetite for everything that both exhausted and delighted them. And the house that James had built with more rooms than his life required filled up with the noise and motion and specific clutter of a family that was building something together. The debt from the promissory note was settled in full by the fall of 1880, not because either of them had been in a hurry about it, but because the combined cattle operation had a very good year, and because Ruth insisted that it be settled formally with a receipt, because she was Ruth and that was how she was, and James loved her for it and accepted the receipt and framed it, which made her laugh in the kitchen and call him ridiculous and then kiss him with considerable warmth, which was also how she was. He kept the buckskin Solomon until the horse was well into his 20s, which was longer than most horses got, and he treated him with the consideration owed to an animal who had been part of one of the best decisions he had ever made. When Solomon finally went, on a quiet winter morning with his head in James's hands, they both felt it in the way you feel the passing of things that mattered. The farm grew in the years that followed. James added a proper smokehouse to replace the old one and extended the barn to accommodate a growing herd. Ruth expanded the kitchen garden into a proper kitchen and medicinal herb operation, and supplied half the county with dried lavender and rosemary and several remedies that Mrs. Hanks recommended to her patients, and quietly, over a period of several years, became the person the farm wives of Sumner County called on when they needed someone who knew things and could be trusted with them. 2 years after Eli, there was another child, a daughter this time, who arrived in the spring with red hair that neither James nor Ruth could account for, and a temperament that was entirely her mother's, composed and watchful and given to sudden, devastating humor. They named her Clara Me Trask, and she was Eli's opposite in every particular and his closest companion from the time she was old enough to follow him anywhere. 4 years after Clara, there was another son, William, who arrived with the same vocal conviction as his older brother but who turned out, as he grew, to be the quiet one of the three, the child who sat near the adults and listened more than he spoke and whose questions, when they came, were the kind that stopped a conversation in its tracks and made everyone think harder than they had intended to. The house had the rooms it needed now, and then some, and the kitchen was full every morning and every evening and all the spaces between, and James sometimes stood in the doorway of it in the early mornings before the house woke up, in the particular stillness of the plains just before dawn, when the stars were still thick overhead, and the darkness smelled of grass and wood smoke, and thought about the man he had been in 1879, alone in this house with its too many rooms, riding to an auction for a horse. He thought about what it would have meant to ride past Ruth Chandler in that auction yard, what he would have come home to, what the house would have remained. He was not a man given to excessive reflection. He was, by nature and training, a practical person, someone more comfortable with a hammer than a journal. But in those early morning moments he felt the full weight of what had been given to him, and he was not careless about it. Ruth found him once, standing in the kitchen doorway in the gray pre-dawn, and she stood beside him in her morning wrapper with her amber hair loose down her back, and she leaned against his shoulder and said nothing for a while, and then she said very quietly, "You are thinking about the auction again." "I do sometimes," he admitted. "So do I," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood in the quiet of the early morning with the plains opening out before them in the first pale light. And the house behind them held everything they had built, the 3 children sleeping in their rooms, the sourdough culture on the kitchen shelf that was older than either of them, the framed receipt on the wall with its $245, the photograph of Elias Chandler beside the kitchen window, where Ruth had moved it so her father could look out over the land he had spent his life making worth having. "I have been thinking," Ruth said, in the tone that meant she had been thinking about this for a while and was now ready to say it, "that in the spring, when the fencing on the east pasture is done, I would like to ride into Caldwell and look at what property is available. I think we have the herd to support a larger operation, and I think there is a parcel along the creek that would be excellent summer pasture." Pruitt mentioned a parcel, James said. 18 acres along the South Creek bend. "I was going to bring it up." She turned to look at him. "You were going to bring it up." I was waiting for the right moment. She studied him with those eyes that had always seen him clearly. "James Trask," she said, "we have been married 11 years and you still wait for the right moment. You still argue with Dickens," he said pleasantly. "The ending is wrong," she said, which was what she always said, and he laughed, and the laugh was as easy as the first one had been in her kitchen in 1879, and perhaps even more so, the laugh of a man who is wholly himself in the place he is standing, which is the only laugh worth having. The spring of 1891 brought the creek pasture into the Trask operation, and with it the beginning of the larger enterprise, what James and Ruth had been building toward without quite naming it, a cattle and farming operation that would outlast them and serve as the foundation for what their children made of the land after them. Eli, who was 10 by then, had his father's way with animals and his mother's instincts for management, and was already, in the way of children who grow up working alongside their parents, more capable than his age suggested. Clara, 8, had decided that she was going to be a teacher, which Ruth supported with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a former teacher's assistant who knew what a good teacher could do for the people in her care. William, at 6, was still mostly interested in the creek and the things that lived in it, but showed signs of the same intellectual appetite his mother had, and James had a shelf of books ready for when that appetite developed the vocabulary to find them. They were, by any measure the county applied, a successful family, successful in the visible way of a well-run farm with healthy cattle and a tight fence, and a kitchen garden that was the envy of every woman who had ever tried to get Rosemary to overwinter in Kansas. But more than that, and more importantly, they were successful in the way that counted most and was hardest to build, which was the invisible infrastructure of a life shared between 2 people who genuinely chose each other every day, not because the choice was easy, but because they understood what the alternative was and found it unacceptable. Ruth had changed in the years since 1879, and so had he, but the change in both of them had the quality of growth rather than transformation. They were more of what they had always been, not something different. She was still direct, still precise, still the woman who managed everything with a focus and competence that he had admired from the first day and had never stopped being grateful for. She still argued with books and had strong opinions about cattle management and made the best sourdough bread in Sumner County, a claim she would modestly deny, but which was universally accepted by everyone who had eaten it. And he was still the man who had ridden to an auction in March of 1879 for a horse and had made a different decision instead. He thought of it sometimes as the pivot on which everything else turned, not a dramatic moment, not a gunfight or a rescue or anything that the dime novels of the day would have recognized as significant. Just a man at a fence rail who heard a woman's voice and decided that riding on was not what he wanted to do. He had never regretted it. Not for a single morning. On the evening of their 12th anniversary, which they marked quietly because they were both more comfortable with quiet than with ceremony. They sat on the expanded front porch of the house, the porch that James had extended the summer after William was born, adding a proper roof and 2 more chairs, and the porch swing that Ruth had wanted, and that the children had immediately colonized as their primary domain, and the 3 children were inside doing the things children do in the evening. And the Kansas sky was doing the thing it did in October, going from blue to every shade of gold and pink, and finally to the deep, extraordinary purple that preceded the stars. 12 years, Ruth said, in the comfortable way of a woman noting something that pleases her. 12 years, he agreed. She had her head tipped back against the porch chair and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked exactly like herself in the fading light, which was the thing he had always loved best about her, that she was always entirely herself. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked it simply, as a genuine question, the way you ask things when you already know the answer but want to hear it said aloud. She turned her head and looked at him, and her face did that thing it still did sometimes, the brightness coming through the composure like light through good cotton, and she said, "James, I am so happy." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she turned her palm up and held his, and they sat together on the porch of the house in the October evening, while the sky went dark and the stars came out, and the children's voices drifted out from inside in the particular musical disorder of young people who have no idea how much they are loved, and the plains opened out around them in every direction in the enormous, quiet, beautiful way they had always done. There would be more years ahead of them, good years and hard years and years, that were some complicated mixture of both, as all years are for people who are genuinely living. Eli would grow into a fine young man who would eventually take over the primary operation of the farm with a blend of his parents' best qualities. Clara would teach school in Caldwell and then in Wichita, would eventually come back to the county, and would spend 30 years teaching children to love books with the same passionate irreverence her mother had brought to every text she encountered. William would study natural sciences, going east to school with the firm financial support of 2 parents who had built, over 12 years, the kind of stability that could absorb the cost of a son's education without blinking, and would become the kind of man who could tell you exactly what lived in any creek in Sumner County and why it mattered. And James and Ruth Trask would grow old together the way they had grown everything together, deliberately, with attention and care, and the willingness to work for what they had, with the particular grace of 2 people who understand that the life they are living is not a given but a choice, renewed daily. But on that October evening in 1891, none of that had happened yet. It was only ahead of them, the future spread out like the plains, wide and full of possibility, and entirely theirs to make of what they would. He held her hand on the porch, and she held his. The stars came out over Kansas one by one, the way they always had and always would, indifferent to everything below them except the people wise enough to look up. And James Trask, who had ridden to the Caldwell livestock auction on a March morning in 1879 to buy a horse, and had come home having changed someone's entire life instead having, if he was honest, changed both their entire lives instead, sat on his porch in the good dark evening of his married life and felt, in the full and unmistakable way that real things are felt, that he was precisely where he was supposed to be, which was, in the end, the only arithmetic that had ever mattered.